Let's look at number 23. Which of the following principles, if true, would justify the argument? So we're looking for a missing assumption to prove this conclusion using the support given. So let's go ahead and see if we can find the gap in the argument, and that's going to be what we're looking for in the answers. I use hidden cameras when filming documentaries since people behave differently when they know that they're being filmed. And although my subjects have been told that there is a camera present, they don't know where it is, they don't know its location, and they act naturally. Hence, here's our conclusion, therefore, my documentaries are more worthwhile than other documentaries in which, for example, people talk directly to the camera. So that's the conclusion, is that my documentaries are more worthwhile than these other documentaries where people talk directly to the camera. Why? What's the reason? What's the support for that conclusion? Well, because they act naturally, right? They act more naturally, according to the previous couple sentences. The way that I do things, they act more naturally, right? They don't know that the camera, well, they do know that the camera is present, but they don't know where it is. They remain unaware of its location, and they act naturally. And that's really the punchline, the fact that they act more naturally. And therefore, since they act more naturally, I'm arguing that my documentaries are more worthwhile than these other ones where they act seemingly less naturally, right? And so we're assuming, what are we assuming here? We're assuming, as we do in any argument, if support, then conclusion. We're assuming if the subjects in a documentary are acting more naturally because they're, for example, in our case, they don't know where the camera is, and they're going to act more naturally. So if they act more naturally, we're assuming that that means that the documentary is then more worthwhile, right? So that's if support, then conclusion. We're assuming if they act more naturally, then that proves that the documentary is made more worthwhile as a result, and specifically more worthwhile than other documentaries where they act less naturally. So let's go ahead and see if we can find something that says something to that effect in the answer choices. A tells us that a documentary that has no purpose other than authentically depicting the behavior of its human subjects can be legitimate. Now, does that prove our conclusion here? Our conclusion is saying that my documentaries are more worthwhile than other documentaries because the people act more genuine, more authentic in them, more naturally, right? A doesn't say anything about whether my documentary should be more worthwhile. It doesn't prove that conclusion. Rather, A says that if you had a documentary that's only purpose was depicting the behavior of its human subjects authentically, that documentary can be legitimate. I don't even know if that applies to the filmmaker's documentaries in this argument, because it doesn't say, this person doesn't say that my purpose is only solely authentically depicting the behavior of my subjects. It just says that I do things in a way that enables them to act more naturally. But I don't know if that's the documentary's only purpose. And even if I did know that, A would just tell me that the documentaries that this person makes can be legitimate. That's a far cry from saying the conclusion, which is that, therefore, they're more worthwhile than other documentaries where they don't do what I'm doing. So A has nothing to do with proving the conclusion, and it doesn't seem to necessarily apply to the documentaries that this person's even talking about, and therefore A is certainly not going to help us out. B tells us that a documentary can only be authentic if it doesn't include any subjects speaking directly to a camera. Now, does this help us prove our conclusion? Our conclusion is that my documentaries are more worthwhile. That's the novelty of the conclusion. More worthwhile than other documentaries that don't do what I do. B has nothing to do with determining how worthwhile a documentary is relative to other documentaries, and therefore B is not going to help us prove that conclusion. B just says a documentary can only be authentic if it doesn't include any subject speaking directly to a camera. Now, that's kind of elaborating on the support brought in this paragraph, which was that I don't film my documentaries in a way where the subjects are aware of the camera, and therefore, since they're not speaking directly to the camera, they're more authentic, right? That's the support, and B kind of amplifies that. B goes a step further and says the only way that the documentary could be authentic is if it doesn't have anyone speaking directly to a camera. Okay, but that doesn't get us to our conclusion, which is that, okay, after all that is all said and done, we're trying to prove the conclusion, which is that, therefore, since all that's true, my documentaries are more worthwhile than other documentaries that don't do this. B has nothing to do with proving that conclusion, so it's not going to help us out. C tells us that people who make documentaries do not have a moral obligation to reveal to their subjects where the camera is that's filming them. Does that prove our conclusion? Does that principle justify the conclusion in this argument? The conclusion in this argument is trying to prove that my documentaries are more worthwhile. They're worth more. They're more worthwhile than other documentaries. C has nothing to do with proving that, right? So if I know that C is true, that is not sufficient to prove our conclusion. C just tells us that the person making this documentary doesn't have a moral obligation to tell them where the cameras are. Okay, fine. But that's not the conclusion here. That doesn't prove our conclusion. Our conclusion is that since the person does this, we're not trying to prove anything about whether they have a moral obligation or not. We're trying to prove that since they do that, this person's documentaries are more worthwhile. C has nothing to do with proving that conclusion. C is sort of a little more of a necessary type of an assumption rather than a sufficient assumption, right? This type of question where it asks you for a principle that, if valid, justifies the argument, it has to be enough to justify. It has to prove the conclusion, right? C doesn't prove the conclusion. It has nothing to do with the conclusion, which is that my documentaries are more worthwhile. C has nothing to do with determining whether a documentary is more or less worthwhile. C is just saying it's okay what this person's doing. This person isn't breaking any kind of moral obligation by filming their documentaries in this way. Now, okay, fine, maybe that's some sort of necessary assumption. I'm not 100% sure if it is in this question, right? Because who's to say that this person has to fulfill any kind of moral obligation? But to the extent that C applies to this argument, it's more something that has to be true in order for it to be okay that this person's acting in this way. But it's not sufficient to prove the conclusion. It doesn't go far enough. It doesn't tell us that, okay, what if you are doing that? Okay, fine, you're abiding by moral rules, by the moral code, according to C, you're not doing anything wrong on a moral level. Okay, fine, so at least it's okay to do that, but that doesn't go far enough. It's not sufficient to prove the conclusion, which is that the documentaries are therefore more worthwhile as a result of you, the filmmaker, doing that, not revealing the location of the camera. So therefore, C does not prove the conclusion. D tells us that the more authentically, the more naturally, in other words, a documentary depicts its subjects, the more worthwhile that documentary is. Now, that's just another way of saying that if a documentary depicts its subjects more authentically, more naturally, then that documentary is going to be more worthwhile. In other words, if support, then conclusion. That's exactly the assumption. That's exactly the logic employed by this argument, right? The support was my documentary enables my subjects to act more naturally, to be depicted more naturally, in other words, more authentically. And therefore, my conclusion is my documentary is more worthwhile than other documentaries that don't do that. And that's assuming D. That's assuming this very clear assumption, which is that the more authentically you depict your subject as a documentary, the more worthwhile that documentary is. It's exactly the missing hole, nothing more, nothing less. Therefore, D is exactly the answer we are looking for. E says that the subject of documentaries shouldn't try to discover the locations of the cameras that are filming them. Now, E is a principle that determines how the subject of the documentary should act, right? Whether they should or shouldn't try to find the camera. Now, that's not relevant to our conclusion. Our conclusion is trying to prove that this person's documentaries are more worthwhile as documentaries than other documentaries. E doesn't help us prove the worthwhileness of a documentary. E is just saying that the people in the documentary, by the way, here's how they should act. Here's whether they should try to discover the locations or not. And specifically, it's saying they should not try to discover the locations. Okay, fine. So that's a good instruction for the people in the documentary, but that has nothing to do with proving our conclusion, which is that therefore this filmmaker's documentaries, because of the way they make them, are more worthwhile than other documentaries. It has nothing to do with proving that point, and therefore it's not the missing assumption. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.